Communication, and the Barry Buccaneer. The Barry Buccaneer, of course, is the school's newspaper, and I am the proud faculty advisor to that newspaper. Today, you will hear speeches from students who were inspired by the work of our very own newspaper. They could have been inspired by the work from our winter edition, which just came out last week, or our fall edition, which you see also still around campus. So I'm really pleased that our work is coming to life through speech and debate.
Desmond Meade was arrested for possession of drugs in 2001 and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. After being released, Meade found his way through homelessness and drug addiction. Today, not only is he the chair of Floridians for a Fair Democracy, but he also holds a law degree from Florida International University. Except he can't sit the bar or practice law because he, like so many other felons, has had his citizenship stripped away from them. Today, I will persuade you that a felon's right to vote should be restored across the United States. Everybody is not perfect. We all make mistakes. A majority of the time, the consequences correlate with the cause. But in this case, it doesn't. July 20th, 2012 was one of the most heartbreaking days of my life. I went to dinner with my uncle, and 30 minutes after arrival, a fight broke out. My uncle, being a decent guy, tries to stop the fight. The police were called, and they arrived just as my uncle was defending himself in the fight. When my uncle explained the situation, the two guys stated that all three of them were in a fight together, and the police believed them over my uncle. Today, my uncle lives his life as a felon. Today, I'll persuade you that voter rights must be restored to felons across the United States. I will cover how 1, the law incarcerates innocent people, 2, the violation of constitutional rights, and 3, the process of restoring voting rights to felons. To begin with, let's discuss how the law incarcerates innocent people. Mark Godsey recently wrote a book called Blind Injustice. In the book, he examines how innocent people can become casualties of flawed eyewitness testimonies. This shows that the system defends the status quo even when it's guilty of railroading innocent people. The government is manipulating society so much to the point where a lot of people strongly support the stripping of a human's voting rights. And who does this disproportionately affect? African Americans. You see, most blacks weren't allowed to vote in the South in the early to mid 1900s, even though in 1870, under the 15th Amendment, black men gained the right to vote. But black men automatically became liable to brutal intimidation and punishments in the event that they tried to vote. In the first picture, it wasn't until, even though they got their right to vote in 1870, it wasn't until the Voting Rights Act was passed where they went to actually vote. Then, the white supremacists, they harshly intimidated people to vote, and that's in the second picture, and that caused them to either be beaten or killed. In the article, Voting Rights for Blacks and Poor Whites in the Jim Crow South, Russell Brooker found people who had gone to prison were not often allowed to vote, so blacks were very often arrested on trumped-up charges or for more minor offenses. The conspiracy gets worse. White owners of mines, farms, and factories simply needed cheap labor, and prisoners provided it. So keeping blacks in prisons was very beneficial to the white majority. And people are still disenfranchised today. People like my uncle didn't get a chance to decide their president. He lost 3 years of his life to the state, and he lost his right to decide his future and that of his children through his vote. He would have to complete the sentence and probation or parole before making an application for the restoration of the right. In the fall issue of the Barry Buccaneer, Paris Razor wrote about one Florida woman who applied for the voter restoration in her article, Should Florida Felons Have Voting Rights Restored? This woman took 3 days off work without pay to take a 10-hour bus ride to Tallahassee. She spent a total of $450 for travel and hotel expenses to be in the state capitol for less than 24 hours and make her petition so she can have her right to vote returned. Now on to my second point, denying felons the right to vote is a violation of the U.S. Voting Rights Act of 1965. According to Lauren Handelsman in the article, Giving the Barking Dog a Bite, Congress amended this section to preclude any practice that oppressively impacts a group of people who want to vote. This emphasizes the 15th Amendment that states, "The right of the citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or obliged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." This amendment clearly outlawed the numerous discriminatory practices like poll taxes and imprisonment present in the South after the Civil War. In spite of the 14th and 15th Amendments, their right was deliberately removed by white supremacist state governments. It also denies these individuals the validation of being a part of something bigger than themselves, a society. If the felon's debt to society is already paid through the time that they serve behind bars, why should they still not have the right to vote? I know what you must be thinking. How can a degenerate criminal go to the polls and make judgments for me and the rest of decent society? Well, states like Florida figured out a way to protect us. According to the recent Amendment 4, convicted felons could have their rights restored, with the exception of sexual offenders and murderers. That brings me to my final point. The states that are attempting to give back humanity to criminals by restoring voting rights. On November 6th, Florida just won at the polls. Amendment 4 was passed, and now felons' right to vote has been restored. This was a real victory because 1.5 million Floridians were previously disenfranchised. In the case of Virginia, the current governor restored the voting rights of 173,000 felons. But if you're in a state like Mississippi and you commit perjury, which is simply telling a lie in court, you will permanently lose the right to vote. Therefore, it is clear that the power to restore the voting rights of felons should not rest with the states themselves. The federal government must make the voting rights of felons uniform across the states. In conclusion, the incarceration of innocent people, violation of constitutional rights, and states not having uniform legislation are just some of the issues affecting felons with regards to voting rights. Unless the government can provide a link between crime and voting, it remains discriminatory to deny felons their voting rights. The denial of the right to vote can even cause convicted felons to disregard the law further, causing them to re-offend. But if they were to be granted their rights to vote, it could fortify their social binds. I'll leave you with this. In the last presidential election, about 6.1 million people couldn't vote due to felony convictions. But in battleground states, like the one that we live in, that same number may have made a real difference between who we could have in the White House and the tweeting madman that we have here today. Wow. Thank you.
So now we will begin the Q&A section. Kayla will answer 2 questions, one from the officials and one from the audience. Please raise your hand, and when called upon, you can move to the mic stand next to the podium, and you can ask your question. Once you come up and ask the question has been answered, you can go back to your seat. Contestants stay seated until the Q&A is finished. Can please Reverend Richard Clements ask the first question for Kayla Adams?
Thank you. Kayla, I wanted to ask you with regard to the information that you've put together with regard to the restoration of these rights. And in light of here in the state of Florida, the 1.5 or more persons whose rights will be restored, and then for those across the nation, I want to know, can you succinctly speak to this question? Is there a perceived threat to the state of Florida and to the United States as it relates to the social and political structure in restoring voting rights to persons who have served their time for felony convictions? I want to know, is there a perceived threat to the state of Florida as well as other states in the country, state of Florida's social and political structure in restoring voting rights to persons who have served their time for felony convictions?
I
political.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.